Good morning. My name is Heddy Ben-Atar, and this is my father-daughter podcast with my dad, Professor Doron Ben-Atar. Life, history, and everyday bullshit, where we talk a little bit about history related to current events, and then about life advice. Good morning, Abba. How are you?
Good. I'm great.
I'm good.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to get started this morning because we've been wanting to record this podcast for a couple of days. Today, we wanted to talk a little bit about hostage situations in U.S. history. So, as many people know, hopefully that Israel and Hamas and other factions are hopefully coming to an agreement where they will release the kidnapped hostages that were kidnapped on October 7th. Hopefully all of them, hopefully soon. We're recording this morning on January 15th at 8:19 a.m. And so they're still in discussions trying to finalize what the plan will be and who to release and how. And you mentioned that there are actually historical hostage situations in America. And so I thought maybe we could take a couple minutes and talk through them for our audience and our listeners. I'm going to ask two quick things about the Iranian hostage crisis, like a quick summary. One, how many hostages were there? If you remember, how long were they held hostage for, and how did they ultimately get released? In like 2 sentences.
The hostages were kept for 444 days. Ultimately, in the beginning, there were more hostages, but they were released. The Iranians released women and African Americans, and also one hostage that was seriously ill. And the
How
terms
many?
of
You didn't say that number yet. How many were there?
Ultimately, 52. What happened is that in retaliation for the taking of the hostages, the Americans took also financial measures against Iran, freezing Iranian assets and stuff like that. And in the hostage deal, basically, the American unfroze the Iranian assets, the Iranian money, and they got the hostages in return. I mean, there was also some declaration that the U.S. will not attack Iran, but the U.S. was not going to attack Iran anyway. It was not relevant. So those, ultimately, the Iranians got nothing out of those hostages. They except humiliate the United States and humiliate President Carter.
Okay, wow.
So the most relevant hostage situation to our time in American history has to do with the hostages taken in the 1980s in Lebanon by Hezbollah. And what happened is that during the Lebanese civil war, Hezbollah and it took Americans who were in Lebanon and as hostages. And the Reagan administration refused to negotiate with hostage takers. So how are you going to get them back? Well, the way you got them back was that Hezbollah is, of course, as all our listeners know, an Iranian militia of Lebanese, but Iranian militia. Iran was fighting against Iraq in a deadly war in the 1980s. All of Iran's military equipment was bought from the United States when Iran was an American ally under the Shah. And so, in order to supply the Iranian army, the United States then provided arms to Iran in exchange for the hostages. So, and even if you want to make it even more complicated, the revenue from that sale was not funneled back to the United States, but was funneled to a militia called the Contras. And that militia was an American-sponsored militia who tried to fight the communist regime in that country. So there was a law in Congress that says you cannot fund the Contras. So the administration found a way around it by selling the weapons to Iran getting the hostages, and then funneling the money to the Contras.
And those people all came back. How long do you remember how long they
Well,
were hostage for?
most of them came back. One was killed,
Hmm.
but they were released. Yes, because of that
Wow.
arms for hostages deal.
That's wild. Wow. Wow. Okay, so then you wanted to talk about two other examples that I had never heard of. So what are those?
Well, the two that come to mind, and again, because I'm an early Americanist, is one, the hostages taken by Indians during the colonial period, which was a very common phenomena. And then the hostages taken by pirates in North Africa in the early 19th century. Both of those things have really uh, relevant echoes to the situation with the hostage of October 7th. The hostages taken by Indians in the colonial period were actually a common Indian practice that they would raid a town, a settlement, and take the hostage um, as a way to kind of negotiate something in return, usually ransom,
Hmm.
and sometimes to do an exchange of prisoners because colonists had Indian hostages. But it's a really interesting thing, the hostage thing, because colonists would imprison specific Indians who they accused, rightly or not, of doing specific things, like, killing a colonist or stealing or something like that. And they assign individual blame. The Indians who rejected this colonial justice did not capture any colonists who were directly involved in the imprisoning. Rather, they captured any colonists, and which led to kind of a conflict because the colonists saw that as an unjustified aggression
Hmm.
because they arrested only people who were guilty, supposedly. Guilt and innocence
Hmm.
is too complicated to assess in these situations. But whereas the Indians selected anybody just by virtue of being member of the colonists' tribe,
Hmm.
it shows different conception of uh, of individuality. But let's get to the Deerfield, Massachusetts massacre of 1704. In 1704, Native Americans from Canada, from the Mohawk tribe, raided the town of Deerfield in Massachusetts, which is in the Berkshires area. I mean, not exactly
Okay.
the Berkshires, but it's western Massachusetts. It was a brutal raid in which they murdered 60 colonists. Now, some of them they murdered in the most brutal way, and then they captured 120 colonists and marched
Wow.
them to Canada. On the march, the Indians continued to murder children, babies sometimes who were delaying their march, sick people, women who could not keep up with the pace, and then when they reached Canada, they spread these hostages among the Indian tribes.
Wow.
What's unique about this massacre and the hostages is that one of the hostages chose not to return to her European society, and her name was Eunice Williams. My close friend John Demos famously wrote a book about it called The Unredeemed Captive, which I probably taught 20 to 30 times in my life.
Okay.
And the story here is interesting, not so much, I think, because Eunice refused to go back. Eunice was 7 or 8 when she was captured, and she forgot English, and she was adopted into an Indian family and so forth. The interesting thing is the way historians, including my my friend John Demos, have come to describe the captive situations, because historians since the 1960s or so have started to describe the Indian taking of hostages as not so bad. That actually the Indians, they didn't kill everybody, and they didn't. They adopted some people into their families, and hey, anyway, it was much better to live in Indian society than in Puritan society, because Indians were more tolerant, and there was not this religious repression, and so forth. And they downplayed the massacre. They downplayed the brutality of the Indians.
Mm.
It's I thought about it really only after October 7th.
Yeah. So essentially, a group of the Mohawk tribe came and they murdered, you said, 60 colonists in Deerfield, Massachusetts, and then returned some 100 or so.
120.
120.
They started with 120, yeah.
They started with 120 that they brought back up to Canada. You keep calling it Canada. Was it really Canada then?
It was Quebec. It was the
Quebec.
French colony of New France, it was called.
So New France versus like the English colony.
Yeah, but you can't think of boundaries at that time the way we do right now. I mean, it was all very porous. And anyway, the Europeans defined the borders, and the Indians ignored it. I mean, everybody ignored them.
And then they distributed the different people that they had kidnapped and all the different hostages to different tribes. And
it made me particularly think about Eunice Williams, because the case of Eunice Williams is that her father, John Williams, never gave up on getting her back, and he went on campaigns and he tried to get her to come back, and she refused. And John Williams is portrayed as this obsessive Puritan who doesn't understand how much better it is for Eunice to stay with her Indian family. But God damn it, Eunice Williams was taken as a kid.
Yeah,
and
wow.
And the fact that she was totally alienated from her family and her culture is not something to celebrate. It's as if Hamas took the Beavis kids, and adopted them and turned them into Hamas terrorists. But should we celebrate it because they could do it? So there's something about the captive narratives that are studied by historians that reflect such political correctness. The poor Indians, whatever they do, we can understand, and this whole notion that the 500,000 Indians or so that lived in all of what we call North America right now somehow should keep this continent for themselves, whereas Europeans have no right to come there, is so absurd.
Yeah. How did they get the Americans back?
Well, the ransom and an exchange of prisoners and stuff like this. 60 of them, of the 120 that were taken, were ultimately ransomed back. I mean, the Indians took them usually for negotiating purposes.
So there was already some kind of negotiation going on when they were captured or something, and then
usually it was, there was some conflict over this, so that sometimes even legitimate conflict, the Indians felt wronged over white incursion on their territory and stuff like, which certainly happened all the time.
Yeah. Okay. This was a very interesting story and example, and one that I don't feel like I had heard of in class or history classes. I clearly should have taken one of your classes, but I don't feel like I learned about this as a practice or an exchange at all in American history. So that's really surprising. What's the second example of the pirating example?
The second one is equally relevant to our situation right now, and it has to do
about what happened and then the relevance. Okay. Tell us the quick story.
So what happened is that the Northern Africa in the 18th century was a home to all sorts of kingdoms/tribes who made their living off piracy. And they would attack European boats, and the piracy will be composed of two things: getting the goods and getting the people, and then getting the Europeans to pay ransom for them. Response of European powers, primarily of Great Britain, that was dominating the sea, was to pay tribute. It was actually also a tool for the British to discourage competition, because the pirates spared British ships and not other ships. Then Britain's domination of the sea was was secured.
Wow, interesting.
Now, after the United States becomes independent, the Americans lose the British protection, and so between 1785 to about 1805. Between 400 and 500 Americans are taken hostages by those pirates.
Wow.
Called Barbary pirates. And the pirates want to get paid for them. But when and the Americans pay until Jefferson comes to power. And when Jefferson comes to power, he says, I'm not paying. It's kind of an old world corrupt thing. It's a bribe and stuff like that. And he declares war on the Barbary pirates.
What?
And he sends American vessels to the Mediterranean. It's the first foreign American intervention. And he declares this war. And first there is this incident of something called the Philadelphia, which rounds aground on the close to Tripoli, which is present-day Libya, and then its sailors are taken captives. And I want to point out to you that what the Barbary pirates did with the hostages was often sell them into slavery, and so and some of them never returned. Some of them were lost. Who knows where they were enslaved or where they died. They also lived in dungeons like the Israeli sausages in Gaza.
Wow.
And were brutally treated. And so just so that the Philadelphia runs aground, and more hostages are taken. And then Americans send more boats, and the first American war hero is called Stephen Decatur, leads a frigate, not a frigate, maybe leads a small group of boats that reaches the Philadelphia and burns it down, so that the pirates cannot use it. And that campaign makes him a national hero. And if you know the anthem of the U.S. Marines, you know that there's a line there from the shores of Tripoli, which is really related to the heroic act of Stephen Decatur.
Wow.
But ultimately, the United States really cannot free the hostages. And ultimately, it has to pay. And it pays. And it's relevant to the hostage situation that we have right now, in that Jefferson's sort of standing on a soapbox and saying, oh, we're not going to pay because we are a virtuous republic and we don't do these old world practices. Sounds really good in theory, but it's irrelevant to releasing the hostages, to freeing your hostages. Ultimately, you have to pay. It's very frustrating about hostage situations. Every so often, there is a dramatic hostage rescue, like the Israeli rescue of the hostages from Entebbe, Uganda, in the 1970s. But those heroic incidents are really the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah. I'm curious. One thing I think about as we're thinking about hopefully these hostage negotiations are kind of going through, and the hostages will be returned in Israel. And I'm curious, like at the time, obviously at the Jeffersonian time, and maybe even in the early 1700s, like you were talking about with the Native American
Deerfield Massacre?
hostage in the Deerfield massacre. Yeah. Um, was there debate about like what price is too high or whatnot? Like, I feel like that's part of the conversation. I think there's like multiple camps, right? There's some that are like, we'll pay any price to get the people home. There's some that say can't, like the Jefferson and, some parts of Israeli society that are like, you can't negotiate with terrorists. That's it. Like, you can't do anything because it'll just encourage more hostage taking and violence, et cetera, and put all of us in more danger. And there's others in the middle that are like, okay, some negotiation, but at what price? And I'm wondering, was there discussion of like along those lines as well, especially when Jefferson kind of came around? Like, was there negotiation on the price, or did they just end up getting what they had asked for? I don't know if you remember this.
No, there was always negotiations. Even
Mhm.
in the Indians, uh, hostage practice that was so common, there was always negotiations about what is the right price. Um, there were negotiations often took years. Uh, People died in captivity. People were abused in captivity, and the same thing with the end of the war against the Barbary pirates in the early 19th century. There's always a
Mm.
price. I mean, the price is not everything. Nobody
Right.
uh, was going to give to the Indians the land that they took away from them, by the way. N- Nobody is going to, uh, you know, completely give to the pirates everything they wanted. This Jefferson story is about the um, incongruity between principled virtue and humanitarianism.
Hmm.
That you have to choose what do you care about, and do you care about your principles or you care about the people?
Principles being, do you care about saying this, I'm building a new America, I don't do this old way, or do you care about the individuals, like the American people and kind like the people that are a part of your country and getting them back? Cool. Okay, thank you for telling these stories. I guess I have one more thought, which is I think a lot about in the American psyche, and in the American psyche we have some opinions and some history and some familiarity with prisoners of war, or traditional war. We've been at war recently, and for the past 100 years or so, like lots of experience with war. I don't feel like we have as much like day-to-day experience or conversation around people that have been taken hostage, even though there are Americans today that are being held against their will, I assume, right? I mean, that's part of what's happening in the
Yeah,
exchange
there's
with
an American held in
Biden. And
Iraq.
I mean, also what's happening with the exchange with Russia and all these exchanges of
Right.
Russians
I mean, all
being,
these prisoners, absolutely, all these spies exchanges and stuff like this. This
those
is
are very
still
similar
common. But
situations,
again,
right?
it's about negotiations.
Okay. We've talked a lot about some hostage taking history in America and how it's kind of turned out, and how Americans and other nations have kind of approached hostage taking. So I think this is a good time for us to take a break. And when we come back, we'll do some life advice. But before we jump into the life advice, I want to shout out two listeners that sent us corrections, at least two that I can think of, Amram and Peter, that we essentially incorrectly pronounced the word liar in the last episodes, that it is not a leer as I had thought it was pronounced, but you were correct in pronouncing it liar. So great job on that.
And
Kudos
I
to
think
you.
that it suggests uh, how American civilization is declining. That a native English speaker mispronounces a word, whereas a foreigner with really a very slight accent, if I would
Right.
say so,
Yes.
gets it right.
Yes, absolutely. So I just wanted to add in that correction. Um, all right, now we're going to jump into our life advice. And we've got a light one today. It's from a friend of mine. And I asked if she had any life advice questions for our podcast. And she wrote back in WhatsApp very simply, yes. Should I stay or should I go? And so Abba, I wanted to ask your advice on that. What what should she do?
About just like that's it? That's all the details?
That's all we got. Should I stay or should I go? I know she's referring to her marriage.
Uh-huh. I have no idea. That's not, I can't comment about that. Should I stay or should I go? I mean, no details. What would you say?
Obviously there's no details. I think I agree. Obviously you can't comment on if she should stay or if she should go. I am curious, like, as a person that is older, um, that has lots of friends that have been divorced or gotten remarried or stayed in difficult marriages, if you have any observations that are worth sharing with our listeners.
I do. So I think that staying married is preferable. Every marriage that I know has a lot of sucky moments.
Mm.
Every partner that I know, with really a couple of exceptions, you and I, are difficult. And the and there are moments when the thought of divorce crosses each and every one of us, whether it is because of a particular incident or a malaise or anything like that. And it's tough. It's tough to forgive a partner, but it's really worth it. Let me give you an example. When my father was in his 50s, he was laid from a job and didn't work for years. And
He was laid off. Yeah.
my parents had a very difficult time. In almost a cliche of sort, my father had an affair with a woman. We used to call her Mrs. Borekas because he said that she told us that she made excellent borekas. So, by the way, when I tell this story to Israeli friends, they all say, "Well, a really good borekas is very hard to find." So,
Makes sense.
anyway, my mother was terribly hurt, terribly hurt. And she kicked him out of the bedroom. So he moved to another bedroom. And for a few years, he lived in a next bedroom.
Wow. It was years. I did not realize that. Were you guys living at home?
No. It was after both my sister and I left home.
Okay.
And they didn't break the marriage. My mother decided not to break the marriage. She never forgave him when we asked her about it. And my mother was, those of you and the listeners who don't know, was just about the most amazing woman you can find. Beautiful, brilliant, virtuous, and everything. And she said, I decided that that's the only family I have. And it paid great dividends. And my mother sacrificed her happiness. There's no doubt about that. But she gained something in return that was bigger and better. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're miserable on a daily level, you should not leave your marriage. I mean, if you're miserable, you should absolutely get divorced and run away.
Okay. I'm going to say I'm kind of surprised by your response because so I have two sets of grandparents, my mom's parents and my dad's parents. And my mom's parents did get divorced before I was born. One of the probably early on in people getting divorced. They did get divorced. And they stayed divorced. Neither of them remarried. and your parents did not get divorced. And my understanding of earlier conversations we've had as a family is I feel like you used to say, if you're unhappy in a marriage, then like no one needs to be unhappy in a marriage, and that like that people are very happy after getting divorced and could and should get divorced. And that you used to like sometimes in some ways wish that your parents had just gotten divorced rather than stay in their unhappy marriage. But it
Right.
sounds like, I mean, you can think both of those things, right? You can feel both of those things at the same time. But I am going to say I'm surprised by your answer because I think of you as a pretty pro-divorce person.
I am a pro-divorce person. And but here is the reason that both.
And let me just add two things. It's not like my grandparents had happy divorces. It's not like grandma and grandpa who is turning 95 next week. You know, it's not like, although he went on to have other relationships, I don't think we think of them as like.
But they were even worse than his marriage.
Were they worse? I don't know. It's hard to know.
Yeah, they were even worse than his marriage.
And I don't think of either of those grandparents as having, like, you know, they both had affairs, right? In both relationships.
Right. Oh, they both had affairs throughout their marriage.
Why?
You know, they had affairs.
My grandma and grandpa had affairs throughout their marriage.
And grandpa
Your
had
parents
affairs,
had one affair,
you know,
and
throughout the marriage. Yes.
Yeah. So, anyways, I just wanted to challenge you on that because I think you think both of those things at the same time. You think so it's preferred to stay married, but also you shouldn't stay in an unhappy marriage. Go talk about what you think.
So here are both how there's no contradiction here.
I said, but you're full of contradictions.
Oh,
but tell me how there's no
such
contradiction.
a nuanced person.
Here,
you know, this
in
is
this context. Yeah.
No, I'm not. When I say my parents should have gotten divorced, and my parents' marriage was horrible even before the affair. I mean, they would be fighting like cat and dogs. I'm thinking of my parents as human beings. I'm thinking of my parents as people like me, I mean, when I was younger, who deserve happiness, who instead of finding a partner that they felt intimately close to, they were living with somebody that, you know, did not give them joy and happiness and stuff like that. So, you know, from the perspective of the personal happiness, then absolutely leave, get a divorce. But when I talk about the benefits of staying married, I have a different view of happiness. Again, if you're miserable, of course you should break a marriage. I'm totally pro-divorce. If somebody is miserable in their marriage, absolutely leave now. Don't wait because your life is not going to wait for you. I'm completely pro-divorce. Let me tell you a story about a very good friend of mine. And he had a very tough marriage, and he was considering splitting. And he asked friends what happens if, you know, when you leave. So he thought it would be his life. And one guy told him, well, the truth is that the benefits of divorce is 1 year of better sex. That's all. Afterwards, it's all the same. And the question is if it's worth breaking up a marriage over 1 year of better sex. We all wish we were more fulfilled or whatever. Everybody always feel insecure about their sex life. So I'm not playing it down. The sex is very important. I mean, if you feel sexually frustrated and you want to have that 1 extra year of good sex, go for it.
Yeah. I want to also, though, acknowledge that, like, you also have lots of friends that you became friends with them in their second marriage, and they have happy, loving, fulfilling marriages.
Absolutely. Right.
And that you do kind of like go back to your average happiness no matter what life event happens. So whether you choose to get divorced or not to get divorced, like, I'm not sure one of them leads to more of a happiness than the other. Like, I think both decisions are kind of okay on some level.
Unless you are really miserable. If your situation with your spouse is like that, then absolutely get up and go. Don't be physically
or go
miserable.
to couples counseling.
Couples counseling.
I know you don't
Schmuckle
believe in
counseling.
couples counseling, but I think it can be
I
helpful.
don't believe or not believe. People do couples counseling. It helps.
Yeah.
My friend ultimately did go to couples counseling, and they stayed married, and I think they're happy for it.
Yeah. Okay. Abba, I'm going to say thank you for this lovely morning podcast. I'm going to just say a quick thank you to all of our listeners. You've been listening to the Life History and Everyday Bullshit podcast. If you have questions for us or want to ask us for some life advice, you can email us at info@bullshtick.com. And this podcast, it was produced and edited by me, Heddy Ben-Atar. Thank you for listening. See you next week.